I think that's my signal. So, good morning again. So last time I was up here, which was only a couple weeks ago, I mentioned that I typically teach the second Sunday of the month, and then I had rescheduled for the third Sunday of October. Well, then apparently our mission speaker rescheduled, so I'm here on the first Sunday of October. So just trying to cover a little bit of everything. So since I only taught a couple weeks ago, instead of a month, everybody's going to remember everything about the last lesson, right? Yep. 100%. So I can just throw this paper kind of out the window, or? Yep. All right. Well, repetition. There we go. We'll keep going through it. So Genesis 41 is where we were last time. If you want to go and hold to that, we'll kind of skim through real quick, and then we'll be moving into 42. But the last lesson, we picked up with Joseph just being appointed second in command of all of the land of Egypt, which was quite the transition from slave to leader of a powerful man's house, back to prisoner, back to, now second command of the entire country. Pretty stellar rise there. But that was just because God was able to use him and interpret Pharaoh's dreams through Joseph. He gets the second command position. So what was Joseph's main job as the number 2 guy? What was his commission? What was he supposed to do? Right. Remember, the dreams had been 7 years of plenty, harvest, 7 years of famine. He was supposed to prepare for those 7 years of famine that was going to be coming after this time of plenty. So how did Joseph set about his job? What did he do? He gathered grain. He went around and he taxed the people a certain percentage. All of this land of plenty you are going to now give to the government so that it can be stored up and then used to sustain us 7 years from then. Grain would have had to potentially be stored for 14 years, we talked about. First grain in usually is the last grain out type deal. Based on the Egyptians' knowledge of food storage and the environment that they lived in, is storing grain for 14 years possible? Absolutely. In fact, they're still finding grain in tombs from thousands of years ago that will germinate. So this was very, very possible. The Bible said it happened, so, obvious it was, but this is always good to remind people. How much was eventually stored up? A lot, and that is exactly the answer I was looking for. Verse 49, we read that. Thus Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. So yes, the answer is a lot. Couldn't even measure it so much. All right, during the time, we talked about Joseph. He was given a wife by Pharaoh. Does anybody remember anything about her? What's that? No. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful priests in the land. So therefore, Joseph had the connection to Pharaoh, but he also had this connection to the Egyptians' religion. He was given this lady as a wife. They had 2 sons. What were their names? They eventually became 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. Manasseh and Ephraim. Very good. See, we do have to remember. Who was the oldest? Manasseh, yes. But later we're going to find out those are switched, and that's going to be in a few lessons from now. So that's a very interesting topic that you just kind of plant in the back of your mind. We'll talk about it later. All right. So what about those 2 names did we learn about Joseph's kind of mental picture of where he was at that point? Their names meant something, but what was the general feel? He was happy where he was in his kind of adopted country. And he was happy to forget about his old family. Those were really the 2 things that you could draw out of those 2 names. He didn't want to go back to Canaan. He was happy in Egypt, the land that he was sold into a slave as. He wanted to stay there. And instead of going back to his long-lost family, he wanted nothing to do with them. In fact, it says he was glad that God was helping him forget about his family, which is kind of ironic, given what's going to happen here in a minute. So 7 years of plenty in the entire region enter 7 years of famine. How are things in Egypt? What's that? In Egypt. How are things in Egypt during the famine? Pretty good. This was all thanks to God's warning and also Joseph's wisdom in using, what God had told him so that he could store up that food. However, the rest of the region was really struggling, including what particular family in the land of Canaan? The family of Jacob, there with his 11 sons and all their servants and wives and children. What does Jacob tell his boys to do? Go to Egypt and buy some food. That is, 10 of the brothers went. Which one stayed behind? Benjamin. Why did Jacob keep Benjamin back? What?
He was Leah's youngest son.
Not Leah's, Rachel's actually. Yep. He was the last surviving son in his mind because Rachel had Joseph and Benjamin. Benjamin was the last son, he thought, his last connection to his favorite wife. He was also the baby. So Jacob said, no, you're staying with me. I don't want anything to happen to you. The rest of you, get out of here. What's it say how his feelings about the other 10? Who knows? All right, so Benjamin stays behind. The 10 brothers head to Egypt, and they eventually end up in front of who? Their long-lost brother Joseph. Exactly. Do they all recognize each other? Well, one of them does. Joseph recognizes his brothers. The brothers do not recognize him. Is this realistic to think? How long had it been? 20 plus years? So Joseph was a teenager. He's now grown into adult. Do you think Joseph physically, clothes and everything looks the same? Last time they saw him, he was at the bottom of a pit getting ready to be sold into a slave. Now he is the number 2 guy, all dressed to the hilt. Also, even if he looked vaguely familiar to the brothers, would they think that he was going to be the number 2 guy in all the land of Egypt? No. So even if they said, that looks exactly like Joseph, but in their mind they would say there's no way that could be him. So it's very realistic to think they would not have recognized him. Joseph doesn't reveal himself to them. And as they're bowing down in front of Joseph, what does he remember? Those dreams he had back when he was a teenager suddenly come true, where the stars are bowing down and the sheaves of wheat are bowing down to him. That's exactly what his brothers. Do you think a little smile came over his face? Told you so. But he keeps his own identity hidden. How does he speak to his brothers? What attitude does he have? What's the Bible say? He spoke harshly to his brothers. And in fact, what does he call them? Spies. So, paint the picture. The brothers, far away from home, completely different land, completely different culture. They're likely in a very heavily secured area. Why? Because the number 2 guy's there. They're protecting the foods, got to have a nice security escort, probably a lot of heavily armed men. They're bowing down in front of this guy, and all of a sudden he says, spies! What kind of day are they having? Probably not a good one. Yeah. So that's where we left it off. Questions, comments? Nothing? All right, Genesis 42 is where we're picking up this morning. So any child that's been picked on by their siblings growing up has to love this story. This is where the underdog kind of, I'm getting back at you type story. Angela wasn't too mean to me as a kid, so I didn't come to mind at all when I was reading this. No. All right, anyway, one of the brothers, after they're called spies, suddenly speaks up and says in verse 10 of chapter 42, "No, my Lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." So you kind of have to imagine at this point Joseph standing up there just saying spies and watching kind of the fear wash over him. I mean, these guys sold him as a slave. And that was plan B. Plan A was they were going to kill him. So he probably doesn't have a lot of fond memories of these guys. He continues the accusations. Verse 12, "Yet he said to them, 'No, but you have come to look at the undefended parts of our land.'" Would this have been a real concern to the Egyptians at this moment in time? I mean, at any point in time, yes, to have spies come in. But why particularly now? Famine. Egypt is the one place in the entire region that actually has food. Do you think there are a lot of other hungry countries out there? A lot of other hungry organizations with heavily armed men that could come in and want to take the food? Absolutely. What are two of the best ways to keep from getting robbed, in my opinion? And I'll share. Stay under the radar. Don't flaunt what you have in front of people. And number two, don't have nice stuff. If you don't have nice things, nobody's going to want to steal it. Right? I mean, it's kind of true. Egypt is violating both of those principles right now. They have lots of very nice stuff in the form of grain, and they're actively selling it to foreigners, probably at a very hefty price. So people know they have grain, they need to protect it. So the accusation of saying you guys are spies is a very serious matter, especially at this point in time. I'm guessing everybody in the room stopped and looked, and all the heavily armed people had their hands on their weapons. That's how I picture the situation right now. Now what we're reading, are words that God inspired Moses to record. But we know that not all of the words are recorded in this particular section. We know that Joseph started asking more questions, kind of like a mini interrogation. And we know this because look at verse 13. So Joseph has just said, no, you have come to look at our undefended parts of the land. 13 is the brothers' response. But they said, your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in a land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no longer alive. Now, if you look at these two verses together, it seems like a completely random response on the servants. You've just been called spies. So your defense is, well, no, there's 10 of us here. One's back home with dad, and one of us is dead. I mean, that's not a defense of why you are not spies, to explain your family situation. I mean, that doesn't justify where you are. So what happened in between of these couple verses? We learned this from chapter 43, because Jacob, their father, wondered exactly the same thing. Why did you say this to this powerful man? Why did you bring up our family business to this guy? Look over there at chapter 43 in verse 6. So Jacob is saying, why do you treat me so badly by telling the man, meaning Joseph, whether you still had another brother? Verse 7, but they said, the man questioned particularly about us and our relatives, saying, is your father alive? Have you another brother? So we answered his questions. So the only reason that the brothers mentioned Benjamin is because Joseph was specifically asking about his younger whole brother. All the other ones were halves. Benjamin was his whole brother. This isn't recorded in chapter 42. But Joseph's interrogation, he was trying to figure out about his family. He's heard nothing about him for 20 years. He doesn't even know if his dad's alive. He doesn't know if his whole brother's alive. He knows nothing about him. He's curious. So that happened in between verse 12 and 13. Maybe you've never wondered that. I always thought it was strange. Joseph seems to get all the information he wants about his family because he then declares his judgment in verse 14, we're back in chapter 42 now. Joseph said to them, it is as I say to you, you are spies. Final judgment. Now, my feeling is that Joseph could have just said, hey, kill him. And he would have had the authority to do that. If he didn't, do you think he could have easily talked Pharaoh into it? Yeah, I think so. Do you think Pharaoh had the authority to kill 10 foreigners in his own country in this time? Absolutely. The brothers, do you think they thought Joseph had the authority? Do you think they're scared out of their mind? Okay, worst case, they're dead. Plan B here is a life of slavery, which probably means you work a few years until you're worked literally to death. That's probably what's going through their mind right now. That's what their future looks like to them. However, Joseph gives them an out. Look at verses 15 through 17. By this you will be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you that he may get your brother while you remain confined. Then your words will be tested whether there is truth in you. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. So he put them together in prison for 3 days. So Joseph locks up his brothers and tells them to choose one of them to return home and get Benjamin. What's Joseph's goal here? Is he really trying to prove that they aren't spies? He knows they're not spies. He wants to see his brother. That's what's at the root of all of this. He wants to see Benjamin. He probably also slightly appreciates that he's now the one confining them. I mean, there is certain irony here. Do you think he looked around for a cistern, a big hole in the ground to throw them all in? I mean, sure, I would have. That's what they did to me. Joseph lets them sweat for 3 days before he sees them again. And it appears that he's calmed down quite a bit. I mean, he did pretty good just composing himself. All of a sudden, here's the brothers you haven't seen for 20 years, the ones that wanted to kill you, and then thought, let's just sell him as a slave. I would have been mad. But he holds his composure, takes care of business, and then he waits 3 days before he goes to see him again. Verses 18 through 20. Now Joseph said to them on the 3rd day, do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison. But as for the rest of you, go, carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified, and you will not die. All right, so now we learn that slavery might not be an option. He's thinking something else. Joseph, seeing his youngest brother, is still the condition for their release and being cleared of the name of spies. But what's changed from Joseph's earlier statement? What's changed? Instead of one of them going back to get the brother, what's he say now? Everybody goes back except for one. So that is a big change from what he earlier said. So try to put yourself here in Joseph's sandals. It's pretty easy to imagine, all these painful events. He spent years suppressing them, and suddenly they all come rushing back to him. I think he did a pretty good job controlling himself, but he's still pretty angry. What do you think those 3 days were like for Joseph? I mean, what do you think is just going through his mind? Do you think he's just angry for 3 days? Do you think he wants to rush and hug his brothers? And then he wants to kill them? And then he wants to sell them as slaves? And then he wants to hug them? I mean, do you think this guy is just ping-ponging back and forth in his mind? Do you think he's sleeping a lot? It's been 20 years. This is very serious events. I think he needed that time just to kind of get himself together. Do you think he prayed during those 3 days at all? I think a lot. I think Joseph had a very strong connection to God, and I think he spent a lot of time in prayer during these 3 days. I think he also realizes if he keeps all the brothers locked up, who is he really hurting in the end? He's hurting the brothers to some extent, but why are the brothers there? To get grain for their wives and their children and their father. So by him confining the family, he's punishing those people which had nothing to do with him being sold as a slave to Egypt. If he keeps all the brothers in prison, they're going to suffer. What happens, again, sending that one brother back? How would that work? I mean, he could carry some grain, but if he's by himself, then animals are going to get loose. It's not a safe environment. Everybody wants food. Even if, say they had servants. They're a fairly wealthy family. It's one brother with a bunch of servants. Are servants always loyal? No. They could have run off with the grain. They could have said, hey, we can make a quick profit. Let's just get rid of this one brother and go. But 10 brothers traveling together, is there a strong likelihood they're actually going to make it home with the food? Yes. And I think Joseph realizes this, and I think that's why he changes his conditions. All right, what else jumps out in verse 18 to you? Right at the end, he says, "For I fear God." So, a couple things. This reinforces my earlier thought that Joseph openly worshiped God. He stood in front of Pharaoh, and instead of taking credit for something, he said, no, God is working through me. The God, the creator of the universe. The God that's over all your other little fake mini-gods that you're worshiping. He openly worshiped God. How do you think his brothers reacted to this? The number 2 guy in Egypt saying, I serve God, your God, the God. I think they were surprised, but they don't really seem to be shocked by it, that we have recorded here at least, which strengthens my thought again that there were people outside of the family of Jacob that worshiped God. Now, does this make sense? Where did all religion start from? Think of the man Noah. Who did he serve? Was there anybody else in the world serving somebody else at that point? No. Do you think Noah and all the people that followed him down to Jacob openly talked about God to people that they met and talked about how God protected them and how he blessed them? Absolutely. Do you think the descendants that came from Noah, there were some that stayed true to God, that worshiped them? I think so. And I think there were a lot of other pockets that suddenly drifted away, and became the pagan religions that the Egyptians were now starting to serve at this point. But the worshiping of God was not, in my mind, confined to one little family in the region of Canaan on the whole planet Earth at this point in time. I think there were other people that were in some way worshiping God. So for them to hear the number 2 guy in Egypt say, I worship the God, may not have been such a big shock to him. All right, so you have to imagine the brothers are relieved to hear that all of them except for one can return home. But it's interesting where their first thoughts go when they hear this. Look at verse 21. They've just been told, all of you but one can go home. Then they said to one another, truly, we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. Why do they immediately think all of this is happening to them? Because of what they did to their brother 20-some years ago. That's immediately where their mind goes. The kind of what comes around goes around theory. Do you think they've been carrying some guilt around for 20 years? A couple decades? It sure seems that way. Then Reuben speaks up, verse 22. Reuben answered them saying, did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Now comes the reckoning for his blood. You gotta love our Reubens, I told you so. I mean, these are brothers, they're siblings. You guys done this to your, brothers, sisters? You never said I told you so to your brother or your sister? Yeah, okay. I mean, these are real people. These are real events. This is not some little fairy tale fiction book. This is the Bible talking about real people. However, is Reuben really justified in saying this? Reuben, you've got to remember, really didn't stand up for Joseph. When they said, let's kill him, did Reuben jump in front of them? No, that's wrong. What did Reuben say? Hey, instead of killing him, let's throw him in a pit. That's a better idea. Yeah, let's do that. Not really the defense of your brother that you really want there. You got to remember, only after Joseph was sold as a slave, something that Reuben was not a part of, afterwards did he rip his clothes and openly grieve for his brother, which is a great lesson for there's a time to stand up for God, and there's a time to stand up for God too late. And this is Reuben. He should have stood up and saved Joseph. So he gets the I told you so, not really justified in saying it, a little misplaced. Maybe, it's 20 years ago, maybe he just forgot how things happen. Maybe he's just, I don't know. The brothers, they're having what they think is a private conversation. But then we have verse 23. They did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them. Now, Joseph was just talking to his brothers. He had talked to them 3 days earlier. This could have been done through an interpreter. However, if he was just talking to them, would they have been surprised that there was an interpreter present? No. So there's something happened here. And we also know later that when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, nope, I kind of gave away the story there, didn't I? That he does it in private. So obviously they can communicate with one another on the same language. So what's going on? We kind of think in our time, in our world, that everyone speaks one language, and that language is English, right? The whole world speaks English. I mean, how many people in here speak multiple languages? I'm sure there's a couple. But generally, I think most of us are probably fluent in one, if that. Right? Okay. However, if you get outside of America, there are people typically speak more than one language and do it very well. Multiple languages. And it's the same way back in this time. It wasn't uncommon. In fact, it was more common, probably for people to have a basic concept of multiple languages. So it's likely that all the conversations up to this point have been in one language that's been familiar to the Egyptians, something that they could understand very well. Maybe not their native tongue, but a common language between the people of Canaan and the people of Egypt. The language that the brothers were probably using just among themselves would have been more of their native tongue. It's been 20 years since Joseph's heard that language. Do you think he understood it and remembered it perfectly? Probably not. But there's somebody there in Joseph's party while these guys suddenly switch to whatever language that does know it. And he conveys that to Joseph. So what's Joseph's reaction to their discussion? Verse 24, he turned away from them and wept. All of a sudden, Joseph sees his brothers in a different light. Up to this point, they've been kind of heartless monsters that either wanted to kill him or sell him as a slave, but now he realizes that, hey, they remember me as a brother, and they feel guilty for what they did. So all this emotion just kind of hitting him is too much. He has to go away, cry, and then compose himself before he comes back. The last part of verse 24. But before he returned from them and spoke to them, but when he returned to them and spoke to them, he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. So now we know which of the 11 is going to stay behind and which 10 are going to go back home. Why Simeon? Anybody ever asked that? What's that? You're asking now? I got the answer for you, or at least my opinion of the answer. It's possible that Simeon was just the one that used to pick on Joseph most of all. That's one theory. You just remember that guy as being the worst one. But I think there's a better reason. What was Simeon's position in terms of youngest to oldest? Or oldest to youngest, rather? What number was he? Second. So if you look at our chart there from way back, Simeon is the number 2 guy. So my opinion, just my opinion, is that Reuben offered to stay. Could have been. But who was the leader of the group? I mean, this time we're talking again. It's a clan type group. The oldest is in charge. I mean, that is rule number 1 of any clan, pretty much. So Reuben's in charge of the group. He could have very well offered to stay. But would you leave the leader, the guy that really led you down to Egypt, the guy that's responsible of getting you back? Maybe not. So then you go to the number 2 guy, Simeon. He's the guy that's got to step up next. Maybe he offered, maybe he was just voted on by the rest of them as you're the guy that's going to stay. Either way, it makes sense that kind of the number 2 guy would be staying behind. Not the number 1, he's in charge of the group. He's got a responsibility to get them home. But number 2 is still there. So Simeon, he's taken away, and the remaining brothers are set free, and they buy their grain. But something interesting happens in verse 25. Then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to restore every man's money in his sack and to give them provisions for the journey. And thus it was done to them. So Joseph gives them their money back. Why would he do this? But there's no right or wrong answer, so I'm actually asking, why would he do this? What's that? Forgave them? Possibly. Huh? So a couple things. I think hearing this last conversation really changes Joseph's opinion of his brothers. Instead of just being angry, he's starting to feel compassion, starting to feel sorry for the guys that he has hated for 2 decades. My opinion, just wants to do something nice for the family. Maybe he just wants to give them their money back. He's maybe feeling a little personal guilt for all of the hatred that he's, misconstrued them as for so long. Now I feel bad about them. That's all right, no charge. You just take that and go. Just go back. Maybe he wants to help his family. Maybe he just wants to mess with them. That's another option. That's a very good option, because is this money going to cause problems later? Absolutely. It's going to add a whole nother wrinkle to the story. So,
about being the brothers, you just got the money in the horn and you're headed back with all that eat for
that's where we're going right next. So you don't really know why, but you could have, you just want to mess with them and kind of whatever, or I really want to be nice and help them, or something in between. Either way, the brothers have their grain. Unbeknownst to them, they also have their money, and they head out. The brothers minus Simeon, that is, head home, verses 26 through 28. So they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed from there. As one of them opened his sack and gave his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money, and behold, it was in the mouth of his sack. Didn't even try to hide it. It's not like they put the money at the bottom of it and poured grain on top. Put it right there on top. And this has been jostling back and forth. You'd think it kind of worked its ways. They wanted it to be obvious. And he said to his brothers, my money has been returned, and behold, it is even in my sack. And their hearts sank, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? So the brothers, they stopped for the night. There's my nice little children's picture for you. They give their animals some feed. What do they find? Money. Their response is interesting, because up to this point, we really don't see a lot of evidence of the brothers being godly individuals. But yet, their first thought goes to God. Think about it. Reuben, was he a nice, upstanding figure? He's the one that took sexual liberties with his father's wife. Not really a moral character there. How about Simeon and Levi? They have any indiscretions in their past? Yeah, they were the premeditated murderers that went in and killed an entire town. How about when you put them all as a whole? They wanted to kill their brother Joseph and thought, let's just sell him as a slave for profit instead. These are not good, upstanding, moral people. But immediately they think, oh no, God is getting us. The reckoning is coming, as they were saying. So this leads me kind of to conclude that Jacob has tried his best to share the love of God with his sons. He's tried to teach his family about God, but it really hasn't stuck. And this might be the point where all of that is now, our dad's been teaching us this. He's been telling us about this. Maybe it's starting to finally sink in. The brothers now have a choice. Do they return to Egypt with the money and say, hey, you guys made a mistake? Their brother is there basically being held as ransom. Or do they head home with the grain, with the money? And if the Egyptians find out, what could happen to Simeon? Bad things. So they have a choice that they've got to make. So, comments or questions? That's where we'll pick up, I think, next time. What do they do? Obviously, I think we know, but you got to leave a cliffhanger of some sort, right? All right. Well, if nothing else, Dan, would you mind closing us out in prayer, please?
Almighty God, we just thank you, Lord, for another day that we can come together and united and worship and praise for you. We thank you, Lord, for the teaching and the preaching that is going on today. We thank you, Lord, most of all for your perfect word and that you've given to us so freely as a gift. We just thank you, Lord. We can look at it and learn from it, put it upon our hearts and apply it to our lives. And we just thank you, Lord, for just this gift that's been given to us through Christ Jesus, the salvation that comes through him. We pray, Lord, to be with us as we go through the week, not just physically, but more importantly spiritually, and to serve you, serve your kingdom, and to spread the gospel. We just pray, Lord, to bring us back together again. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right. Thank you.